Hello and welcome back. I'm your host Teresa, and today's video from Bumblebee is all about the top 10 scandalous Wild West figures you didn't learn about. Starting our list is John Joel Glanton and his notorious gang. Like many Wild West figures on our list, he's got 2 pistols, a bounty on his head, and a long southern name. John was a soldier of fortune as much as an outlaw. Being an outlaw sent him running to Texas, where in 1835 he was living with his parents. It's during his time there that he marries, but it was a high-tension time period with the indigenous people of the South, and he unfortunately lost his first wife in one of their raids. In 1849, he leaves behind his second wife, who's said to be the most beautiful woman in the Republic of Texas, to ride out of San Antonio for California with 30 well-armed gold seekers. He used his hatred of indigenous peoples to fuel his bounty hunting and again to collect and trade scalps and skulls for money. By 1850, however, it became increasingly difficult for the Glanton gang to find bounties for indigenous people specifically, his sick preference, and the group began to attack peaceful agricultural clans in the vicinity of Fort El Notre. He even started to attack innocent Mexican settlements in order to claim false bounties. His final escalation was when his gang seized a river ferry. While operating the ferry, they killed Mexican and American passengers alike for their money and goods. Ethnicity of the target no longer mattered to them, but thankfully they were stopped by the Yuma indigenous clan in the mid-1850s. What you reap is what you sow. These next escape artists were led by Judd Roberts. They robbed and killed an innocent rancher in 1885. Before that, Judd and his gang of 4 didn't really have much notoriety. They collected some bounties and they had some on their own heads. But they were never caught, always evading capture. Well, this time the Texas Rangers captured Roberts and one of his men. This was a time where hanging was the most sought-after punishment, so Roberts and his cohort were put in the newest, most escape-proof jail in San Antonio. They may have only just become known names, but their ability to evade and escape authorities was always acknowledged. A short time later, a third member of the Roberts' gang is captured and placed in a lesser protected prison. With only one man still free, it's no surprise that local jail immediately and mysteriously burnt down, roasting the desperado inside alive. After 4 months, Roberts and his cohort escape from the San Antonio jail as predicted, reunite with their third, and Roberts was soon stealing horses in the Texas Panhandle once more. He periodically visited Williamson County to see relatives and friends, and Texas Ranger Ira Atten was dispatched to intercept him. After several clashes and near misses, the future Ranger John Hughes killed Roberts in the Panhandle. Eyes, knees, fingers, toes. Well, if we're counting, ThreeFinger Jack had an obvious amount. Jokes aside, he didn't actually have 3 fingers. This is just one of those cool Western nicknames on the list. A notorious Arizona outlaw, he'd been captured and jailed back in 1895. I guess prison escape was super easy back then because he busted out and joined the Blackjack Christians. He's in this gang until he meets Burt Alvord and Billy Stiles. It's hard not to be nervous around them after all. They were sheriffs, but only by day. In some strange twist, these 2 who you'll be learning about next were outlaws by night. Alongside them were their posse of 4. During a train robbery in Fairbank, Texas, the train pulled into the station, and as the crowd was milling around, the outlaws mingled in the crowd pretending to be drunken cowboys. Sheriff Jeff Milton was standing in the open door of the baggage car when the outlaws opened fire, and he unfortunately was hit. While he was bleeding, the sheriff waited for the bystanders to clear, and he fired back. ThreeFinger Jack was struck in the chest. As he died, Jack spilled the beans on his accomplices, which would be the ultimate snitch move, but also so that I can tell you the story of our next segment, which is all about Burt Alvord, the reverse Batman. Ah yes, a prestigious and respected sheriff. Burt came from the West with his father, who was a justice of the peace. As a teen, he worked in corrals and stables and even witnessed the famous shootout and, 3 years later, the execution of John Heath. Burt became a deputy to John Slaughter in 1886 and spent 4 years helping him track down thieves and rustlers. He became particularly adept at ferreting out information concerning the whereabouts of various fugitives, reportedly playing a drunk man like a fiddle. Alvord drifts into Mexico in the mid-1890s, rustling cattle, before becoming a law constable in Fairbank and then Willcox, Arizona. It's here he becomes the Batman. Using his position and seeing the prosperity of criminals for so long, he masterminded a band of the best train robbers he'd ever met. Even after arrests in 1900 and 1903, Alvord and Billy Stiles, his deputy and accomplice, managed to escape a capture. When he collects a bounty too high to ever go unnoticed as a lawman again, shout out to ThreeFinger Jack above, Alvord spreads a rumor of he and Billy's deaths, even sending 2 coffins to the town of Tombstone. The scheme naturally didn't work, the coffins were literally empty. So Alvord is recaptured in 1904, but after 2 years in prison at Yuma, he was released and went to Latin America. He reportedly turned up in Venezuela and in Panama as a canal worker. Supposedly he died around 1910. The worst Biggest alias in the West award goes to Big Steve. Why? Because his name was Steve Long. Like, if he'd been tall and skinny, would they have called him Long Steve? No creativity, these Westerners. No debate though, Big Steve was big. He was a whopping 6'6" and rumored to be 3 feet wide in the shoulders alone. His background is very obscure to us, but this northerner established himself as a vicious gunman and La Marie. In 1867, he obtained the deputy marshal position and had a series of bloody gun duels within the first month. This grabs the attention of the Moyer brothers, who had founded the town and appointed themselves the justice of the peace and marshal respectively. 6 pistols, 1 in each hand, the trio dished out justice in the back room of the town saloon, ordering ranchers to sign over their deeds to their lands and miners to hand over their claims. Anyone who refused them was killed, and between that and the crooked card games, that saloon became known as the Bucket of Blood. Meanwhile, a local rancher was beginning to form a vigilante group to put the trio out of business. One night, after moonlighting as a thief, Long is injured by one of his intended victims. His fiancée is dressing the wound when Long confides in her how he got it. She's disgusted and tells the vigilante group about his attempted robbery. Don't trust no well anyways. The Bucket of Blood was stormed shortly after. On October 28, 1868, the vigilantes proceeded to hang the men, but not before Long made an unusual request to have his boots removed. Why? His last words were, "My mother always said that I'd die with my shoes on." Girl boss alert, let's talk about Miss Calamity Jane. Now that is a cool alias, and a definite upgrade from her original name of Martha Jane Canary, born in Missouri around 1856. By the time she's a teen, Jane's sharpshooting was the talk of the town, and she was the head of her orphaned household. Said to be a whiskey-drinking, gun-tootin' type of gal, she once even spat tobacco at the main actress of a play who is said to have done a terrible role. Jane worked hard and fought harder. She earned her nickname Calamity Jane when she rescued an army captain from his camp being attacked by indigenous clans. She's reported to have saved the lives of 6 stagecoach passengers in 1876 when they were attacked by bandits, and she even nursed people back to health during the Deadwood smallpox outbreak, while cussing them out, of course. Having the reputation for being able to handle a horse better than most men and shoot like a cowboy, her skills took her into Buffalo Bill's Wild West show in 1895, where she performed sharpshooting astride her horse. Jane's struggle with alcoholism lost her this job, and then her following won at a newspaper. Finally, Jane returns to Deadwood, where she was recovering and tired. She works in a caring for the girls, doing their laundry and cooking until she passes. Though she married a man named Burke at the age 33, when Jane died in 1903, she asked to be buried next to Wild Bill Hickok. Rumor has it that Hickok was the only man she ever loved, and her wish was granted. The funeral was the largest ever held in Deadwood for a woman, and Calamity's coffin was closed by a man who, as a boy, she had nursed back to health when the smallpox epidemic took so many lives in Deadwood. His 2 passions in life were his mama and hardcore crime, Thomas Hodges and the Tom Bell Gang. He even started off as a doctor, all the makings of what your mama would want for you. Well, with the exception of crime, but hey, it pays money, so you know. Thomas started as a medical orderly in the Mexican War. He moved to Nashville to start his practice afterwards. Doctor life got boring, and when the gold rush was tempting, he set off to California, where he failed tremendously at prospecting, so just to become a thief, I guess, under the alias Tom Bell. He has an arrest in 1855, but escapes because I guess jails were unlocked buildings or something back then. He escapes with notorious criminal named Bill Gristy, a known thief and arsonist, and a few others. With their help, Hodges formed the Tom Bell Gang and began to prey regularly upon the gold rush area. Their fumble was killing a woman in an unsuccessful robbery attempt, and the gang was tenaciously pursued through the 1856 until Gristy was captured and spilled the beans. Before that, there were violent escapes from the clutches of justice, but because Grizzly's information, Hodges was finally captured by a posse near the Merced River. He wrote letters to his mother and Elizabeth Hood, his mistress and partner in crime, before his execution in 1856. Let's channel some Bonnie and Clyde energy by talking about Jim Reed. Good old Jim was born 8 miles from the Missouri hamlet to a relatively wealthy family. At 17, he moved to Carthage, where he had his first encounter with Myra Bell Shirley. The youths courted, but she was a few years younger, and her father disapproved because of it, leading Reed to quite literally have a gun duel with Myra's father. Reed is forced to leave and takes advantage of the newly started Civil War to join a guerrilla raiders group, where he got a taste for lawless and reckless abandon after a life of spoils. After the war, he continues his reckless abandon. He killed 2 men in Missouri and fled to Dallas, and once again ran into Myra, whose family had moved there after he had, well, killed her dad. They became lovers once more, seeing as she already had a daughter from a past man who really cared about what happened to her reputation now. The two take her daughter and move and have another child together. This family of 4 pulls holdups around the state together for a few months before were returning to Texas to buy a farm with their murder money. They could have left there, put the crime behind them, but instead Reed, Myra, and two other thieves break into the cabin of Creek Indian chief Watt Grayson. He handled the government subsidies for the tribe, and Reed gang tragically tortured the chief until he tells them where they can find the rumored $30,000. For this and a variety of other misdeeds, Reed soon was hotly pressed by the law and he was forced to leave Myra behind. His bounty grows and grows as he loses control, and within a few months, a close acquaintance kills Reed for the bounty on his head. Let's follow that famous name up with another, Nat Love. He, like Geronimo in the next segment, is an exemplary historical figure that most people either haven't heard of or they don't know much of his story. Born on a plantation in 1854 Tennessee, Nat fought past the difficulties and challenges of obtaining an education while enslaved, and learned how to read and write as a child with the help of his father and literate people around him. Slavery came to a thankful end, but the strings attached meant that, like many others, Nat's parents stayed on the Love plantation and worked as sharecroppers. Teenage Nat worked in the stables and gained a reputation as a gifted horsebreaker. He sold his own beloved horse to hit the big city Dodge, Kansas at age 16. Working on ranches as a literal cowboy and cattle driver, he lived an eventful life, having run into cattle rustlers, enduring inclement weather, had his horse shot out from beneath him, and even met the likes of Pat Matterson and Billy the Kid. Honing his skills on the range, he became an expert marksman and cowboy and chose to test his abilities in the Deadwood Rodeo of 1876. He won the $200 prize money and prevailed in 2 shooting contests as well. It's a successful lassoing in a bronco ride that earned him the nickname Deadwood Dick, which is hard as. But in 1877, he has a unique cultural run-in when a band of Pima natives capture him while he's rounding up stray cattle that happen to wander onto their territories. The Pimas had injured Love when he tried to escape their capture, but instead of ending his life, they chose to nurse him back to health out of respect for his African American heritage and the plight of his people, which they considered completely uninvolved in their battle against the government. Good old Love got better and took off on one of the Pima's fastest horses, traveling over 100 miles bareback right into the arms of Alice Love, whom he chose to marry in 1889 and abandon the cowboy life for good. He died in 1921 at the age of 67 and wrote a memoir in 1907 you can still read today. The name that inspired many Western flicks, whether old or new, is Geronimo. Unfortunately, most adaptions are incredibly offensive and inaccurate, and a lot of people don't actually know anything about the man and what may be the biggest scandal of the West. So let's learn. Born Goyacla, his story begins when Geronimo began inciting countless raids against the US and Mexican armies after his wife and 3 children and mother were by Mexican troops in the mid-1850s. Wild with grief, it's during an Apache tradition of grieving that he hears the voice of an ancestor tell him, "No gun will ever kill you. I will take the bullets from the guns and I will guide your arrows." Well, Geronimo got his nickname for this exact reason. His ancestors' promise that no bullets could harm him appeared to be true as he continuously escapes law enforcement, Anglo-Americans, and Mexican troops. He's wounded multiple times, but he always recovers. He becomes a newspaper sensation. The more often Geronimo escaped and the longer he was able to disappear, the more embarrassed the US military and politicians grew by this scandal. After all, an indigenous chief and his clan were single-handedly stopping the entire government from infringing any further on their promised territory, going against everything the government smeared about the indigenous peoples at the time. Geronimo repeatedly evaded capture and life on reservation. In his famous final escape, a full quarter of the US standing army pursued him and his followers and still couldn't make it. When Geronimo was captured on September 4th of 1886, he was the last Native American leader to formally surrender to the US military. He spent the last 23 years of his life as a prisoner of war, paraded by the American government for approved trips to world fairs and Wild West shows like a display. He was even in attendance at President Theodore Roosevelt's inauguration, but Roosevelt refused Geronimo's plea to permit the Chickawawas to return to their native lands in the West. On his deathbed 3 years later, Geronimo reportedly told his nephew he regretted surrendering to the US. "I should have fought until I was the last man alive," he told him. Geronimo was buried at the Apache Indian Prisoners of War Cemetery in Fort Still, Oklahoma, but thankfully had his body returned to rightful land. Well, that's all for today's video. I hope you guys enjoyed, and like all the rootin' and tootin' content we've put out lately, be sure to like and subscribe to see more, and comment down below what you'd want your Wild West alias to be.